I stood in the doorway of the upscale restaurant, clutching my portfolio case with white knuckles. The investment statement inside represented everything I'd built over 5 years, $850,000 in assets that they said I'd never accumulate. My mother's cutting words from last Thanksgiving still burned in my ears. "You'll never amount to anything in finance. What a waste of potential." Tonight, those words would finally be answered, not with anger, but with irrefutable proof of my success. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation to my family's annual spring gathering arrived via text message from my sister Vanessa, not my mother. That alone spoke volumes about where I stood in the family hierarchy. "Mom wants everyone at Bellini's next Friday at 7. She's making an announcement. Please try to come this time." The passive-aggressive "this time" stung, referencing the Christmas dinner I'd missed while closing my biggest client account to date. In my family, professional accomplishments meant nothing compared to attendance at family functions. My absence had apparently been the main topic of conversation that evening, according to my brother Michael's apologetic text afterward. I considered declining. My consulting business was finally thriving after years of struggle, and I had a prospective client meeting I could conveniently schedule for that evening. The perfect excuse to avoid another night of subtle jabs and disappointed glances. But something in me, perhaps masochism, perhaps hope, made me respond with a simple, "I'll be there." Working from my downtown apartment that morning, I found myself distracted by thoughts of the upcoming dinner. My relationship with my mother had been strained for as long as I could remember, but it had deteriorated dramatically 5 years ago, when I abandoned a promising legal career to start my own financial consulting firm. "Law is respectable, Sophia," she'd said, disapproval dripping from every syllable. "Only gamblers and charlatans make their living from other people's money." My father, though not unkind, had offered no defense. He'd spent 40 years as a history professor at the state university, and anything outside academia or traditional professions was foreign territory. My decision baffled him as much as it angered my mother. Only my grandfather, my father's father, had supported me. A self-made businessman who'd built a regional hardware chain from a single store, he understood the entrepreneurial drive that my parents couldn't comprehend. He'd offered both emotional encouragement and a small loan to help me get started. "They don't understand people like us, Sophia," he'd told me. "We see opportunities where others see risk. That's a gift, not a flaw." His death 3 years ago had removed my only ally within the family. The modest inheritance he'd left me, $75,000, and his collection of investment books, had become the foundation of both my business strategy and my personal portfolio. I'd leveraged his wisdom and that seed money into an investment approach that had yielded returns that would have made him proud. But my family remained unimpressed. My sister Vanessa, with her surgical practice and doctor husband, and my brother, Michael, tenured at an Ivy League university by 34, fulfilled my parents' expectations perfectly. Their achievements were celebrated at every family gathering, their framed credentials displayed prominently in my parents' living room. My business cards were notably absent from that shrine to academic and professional success. Last Thanksgiving had been the breaking point. After enduring an hour of my mother's not-so-subtle comparisons between my siblings' stability and my little business experiment, I'd made the mistake of mentioning a particularly successful investment strategy I'd developed for tech sector clients. My mother's laugh had cut through the dinner table conversation. "Sophia, please. You manage spreadsheets, not real assets. Your brother shapes young minds, and your sister saves lives. What lasting contribution will you ever make?" When I'd tried to explain the economic impact of my work, she'd dismissed me with a wave. "When you were in law school, we thought you might become something significant. Now look at you, 33 and still playing with numbers, hoping to strike it rich through some scheme. You'll never amount to anything in finance. What a waste of potential. The table had fallen silent. My father had studied his mashed potatoes with sudden fascination. Vanessa had at least had the grace to look uncomfortable, while Michael had tried to change the subject, but the damage was done. I'd excused myself shortly after, citing client work, and had limited my family interactions to brief phone calls and obligatory holiday texts ever since. Now, 6 months later, I found myself preparing for another potential battlefield disguised as a family dinner. But something had changed within me. The hurt remained, but it was overshadowed by a quiet confidence I hadn't possessed at Thanksgiving. My business had more than doubled. My investment strategies had yielded returns that industry veterans had praised. My personal portfolio, managed using the same principles I applied for clients, had grown to a level that even I found somewhat astonishing. I opened my laptop and pulled up my latest financial statement. The numbers were irrefutable. $853,427. 51 in diversified assets, built from that initial $75,000 inheritance and consistent strategic investments. An average annual return that exceeded market performance by 22%. A client list that now included 2 Fortune 500 executives and a retired senator. For years, I'd sought my mother's approval through explanations and arguments, trying to make her understand the value and legitimacy of my chosen field. It had never worked. Perhaps it was time for a different approach. Perhaps numbers, not words, would finally speak a language she couldn't dismiss. I printed the portfolio statement, along with documentation of my business growth and client testimonials. The stack of papers represented not just financial success, but personal vindication, proof that my scheme was in fact a legitimate and valuable enterprise. I placed them in a professional portfolio case, the kind I used for client presentations, and set it aside for the evening ahead. As I dressed for dinner, selecting a charcoal gray suit that projected the understated competence I cultivated with clients, I rehearsed potential scenarios in my mind. I wouldn't volunteer the information unprompted. That would appear defensive. But if the usual criticisms began, I would be prepared with concrete evidence rather than emotional pleas for understanding. The drive to Bellini's, an Italian restaurant my mother favored for family occasions, gave me time to center myself. I reminded myself that I hadn't chosen my career for my parents' approval. I'd chosen it because it aligned with my strengths and passions, because it allowed me to help others build financial security while achieving my own, because it gave me the independence and intellectual challenge I craved. Whatever happened tonight, those truths wouldn't change. My success wasn't defined by my mother's recognition of it. Yet, as I parked in the restaurant lot and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, I couldn't deny the lingering hope that tonight might somehow bridge the chasm between us, that the evidence in my portfolio might accomplish what years of explanations had failed to achieve. I took a deep breath, grabbed the portfolio case from the passenger seat, and headed for the restaurant entrance. Whatever announcement my mother planned to make, whatever criticisms might come my way, I was prepared. Not just with documentation of my achievements, but with the quiet strength that comes from knowing your own worth, regardless of others' inability to see it. Bellini's interior glowed with warm lighting, crystal chandeliers reflecting in polished walnut tables. The restaurant had been my mother's favorite since I was a child, unchanging in its old-world elegance and traditional cuisine. A perfect metaphor for her unwavering commitment to convention. The maitre d' smiled in recognition. "Ms. Reeves, your family is already seated in the private dining room. May I show you the way?" I nodded, adjusting my grip on the portfolio case as I followed him through the main dining area. My pulse quickened with each step, the familiar mixture of dread and hope I'd come to associate with family gatherings intensifying as we approached the partially closed door at the back of the restaurant. "Sophia!" My father rose as I entered, his smile genuine if cautious. At 65, he looked more fragile than I remembered, his academic's stoop more pronounced, his hair thinner. We were beginning to worry. "I'm exactly on time, Dad," I said, accepting his brief embrace. 7:00 as requested. "Which is 15 minutes late in your mother's calendar," he murmured, too softly for the others to hear. Around the table sat the usual assembly, my mother at the head, imperious in a navy blue dress and pearls, Vanessa and her husband Robert, to her right, both looking polished and professional even after workdays at their respective medical practices, Michael across from them, alone tonight without his wife Clara, who was likely home with their infant daughter, and 2 empty chairs, one for me and one for my Aunt Patricia, my mother's younger sister, who was running characteristically late. Sophia. My mother acknowledged me with a nod, her eyes dropping briefly to the portfolio case before returning to my face. "I see you managed to fit us into your schedule." "Hello, Mother. It's good to see you too." I kept my voice neutral as I took the empty seat beside Michael, placing the portfolio case on the floor next to me. "Work accoutrement at a family dinner?" She raised an eyebrow. "Surely your clients can survive one evening without you." Before I could respond, Michael intervened with practiced diplomacy. "How is the business going, Soph? You mentioned expanding your office space when we spoke last month." I smiled gratefully at him. Despite his traditional career path, Michael had never condescended to me about my choices. "The expansion is complete. 2 additional offices and a proper conference room now. I've hired an associate and a full-time assistant." "Playing landlord now, are we?" my mother commented. "I suppose that's slightly more concrete than pushing electronic money around." Vanessa winced. "Mother, can we at least order before starting this?" "Starting what?" My mother's tone was all innocence. "I'm simply taking an interest in Sophia's endeavors." The waiter arrived at that moment, saving me from having to respond. We ordered drinks, and I used the interruption to study my mother more carefully. Behind her carefully maintained facade, something seemed different. There was tension in the corners of her mouth, a tightness around her eyes that suggested more than her usual critical disposition. My sister had mentioned an announcement. Looking at my mother now, I felt a flicker of concern beneath my defensiveness. Was this about her health? My father's? The familiar family dynamic of criticism and resistance suddenly seemed petty if something more serious was brewing. "Where's Aunt Patricia?" I asked, redirecting the conversation. "Is she joining us?" "She's been delayed by traffic," my father replied. "She texted that we should start without her." The waiter returned with our drinks and took food orders. As menus were collected and bread was served, an awkward silence settled over the table. Whatever announcement was coming, no one seemed eager to initiate it. Finally, after taking a deliberate sip of her wine, my mother set her glass down with purpose. "I suppose we might as well address the elephant in the room while we wait for the appetizers." My siblings exchanged glances. Even Robert, usually absorbed in his phone during family gatherings, looked up with interest. "As you know," my mother continued, "your father retired from the university last year. What you don't know is that our financial situation has become complicated." My father studied his water glass, a flush rising on his neck. This was clearly not a disclosure he'd championed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "We've always been conservative with money," my mother said, her voice tight. "Your father's pension and our savings should have been more than adequate for a comfortable retirement. However, certain investments have not performed as expected." Understanding dawned, along with a sinking feeling in my stomach. This wasn't about health issues. This was about money, my professional territory, and my mother's most consistent point of criticism toward me. "What kind of investments?" I asked carefully. My mother's lips thinned. "That's hardly relevant, Sophia." It might be, actually, I countered, keeping my tone respectful but firm. Different investment types have different risk profiles and recovery potentials. If you must know, they were real estate investments, perfectly respectable and traditionally reliable, unlike those technology gambles you're so fond of. She straightened her napkin unnecessarily. A development project that your father's colleague assured us was essentially guaranteed. They're now 2 years behind schedule with no completion date in sight. Our capital is effectively frozen. How much are we talking about? Michael asked. Nearly 60% of our retirement savings, my father admitted quietly. We were promised returns that would supplement my pension significantly. I managed to keep my expression neutral, but inwardly I winced. This was exactly the kind of high-concentration risk I advised my clients against. Diversification and liquidity were foundational principles in my investment approach, principles my mother had repeatedly dismissed as overly cautious. The announcement, my mother continued, her voice regaining its usual authority, is that we'll be downsizing. The house you all grew up in will be going on the market next month. We've found a condominium that will be more manageable. Silence fell around the table as we processed this information. Our family home, a sprawling colonial in an established neighborhood, had been a constant in our lives for over 30 years. The thought of my parents living anywhere else seemed impossible. That's significant, Vanessa finally said. But sensible, if the house is more than you need now. Sensible necessity, my mother corrected, not preference. Have you consulted with a financial advisor? I asked. Someone who could look at your overall position, not just this one. Troubled investment? My mother's laugh held no humor. Oh, Sophia. Always trying to insert your little hobby into serious matters. This situation requires experienced professionals, not experimental approaches. The familiar dismissal stung, but I persisted. Mother, financial consulting is literally my profession. I have clients facing similar retirement recalibrations. There might be options you haven't considered. Yes. Well, we've already engaged. Harrington Financial. Thomas Harrington has managed university endowments for decades. He has actual credentials and institutional experience. She emphasized these last words pointedly. I felt my cheeks flush. Thomas Harrington was indeed well established, and notorious among younger financial professionals for his outdated approaches and excessive fees. His firm coasted on reputation while delivering mediocre results and charging premium rates. Exactly. The kind of old-guard establishment figure my mother would trust implicitly. The appetizers arrived, temporarily halting the conversation. As plates were distributed, I noticed Michael watching me with concern. He knew me well enough to recognize the battle between professional indignation and familial respect playing out behind my careful expression. Perhaps we could revisit this after dinner, my father suggested diplomatically. Tonight should be about family, not finances. Of course, I agreed, grateful for the reprieve. We should focus on enjoying the meal. But as conversation shifted to safer topics, Michael's daughter's first words, Vanessa's upcoming medical conference, my mind continued processing what I'd learned. My parents were in trouble, genuine trouble, and were following advice that would likely compound their problems rather than solve them. The portfolio case beside my chair, brought to defend my career against criticism, now represented something entirely different. Potential help I could offer, if only they would accept it. When Aunt Patricia finally arrived, flustered and apologetic, the dynamic shifted again. Unlike my mother, Patricia had always shown genuine interest in my career. After quickly being updated on the retirement situation, she turned to me with raised eyebrows. Sophia, surely you have some insights here. This is exactly your field. Before I could respond, my mother interjected. Patricia, please. Sophia works with tech startups and young professionals building their first portfolios. This is an entirely different situation requiring established expertise. Actually, I said carefully, about 40% of my clients are pre-retirees or recently retired. Helping people transition from wealth accumulation to sustainable distribution is a core part of my practice. My mother's expression suggested she didn't believe me, but Patricia pressed on. Well then, what would you suggest for a situation like this? All eyes turned to me. This was the opening I needed, not to prove my worth through boasting about my own success, but to demonstrate my expertise by offering genuinely helpful insights. I set down my fork, formulating my response carefully. The portfolio case waited by my side, its contents suddenly seeming both more relevant and less important than they had an hour ago. I took a deep breath, acutely aware of the scrutiny from every person at the table. This wasn't about defending my career choice anymore. It was about potentially helping my parents avoid a significant financial misstep. First, I'd want to see a complete picture of the situation before making specific recommendations, I began, using the same measured tone I adopted with new clients. But speaking generally, there are several approaches worth considering when dealing with an illiquid investment that's tying up retirement capital. I folded my hands on the table, conscious of maintaining a balance between professional confidence and familial respect. The immediate issue seems to be liquidity. You need access to capital that's currently frozen in this development project. Selling the house addresses that, but it's a significant life change that may not be necessary depending on your overall financial position. My mother's expression remained skeptical, but my father leaned forward slightly, his academic's curiosity engaged. What alternatives would you suggest? He asked. Without seeing your complete financial picture, I can only speak in general terms, I cautioned. But typically, I'd examine several options. Restructuring existing liquid investments to generate more income, exploring a securities-backed line of credit against any investment portfolio you maintain, investigating whether the real estate investment itself can be sold on the secondary market, possibly at a discount, but better than leaving it inaccessible indefinitely, or determining if there are legal remedies if misrepresentation was involved in the initial investment presentation. My brother Michael nodded thoughtfully. Those sound like reasonable approaches. They sound like generalities, my mother countered, though with less dismissiveness than I expected. Thomas has already reviewed our situation comprehensively. What specific strategy has he recommended? I asked, genuinely curious. The house sale, of course, she replied, and consolidating our remaining investments into his firm's proprietary managed funds. I couldn't quite suppress my wince. And what are the management fees on those funds? I believe it's an annual fee of 2%, plus some performance incentives, my father said. Thomas assures us it's standard for the level of service. It took considerable effort not to react visibly. 2% plus performance fees would erode their already compromised retirement savings at an alarming rate. For comparison, most of my clients paid less than 1% all-inclusive, and I considered that the upper ethical limit for retirement accounts. I see, I said carefully. And has he provided projections showing how those fees impact your long-term financial sustainability? My mother's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting Thomas isn't being forthright? I'm suggesting that all fees should be transparent and justified by value delivered, I clarified. A 2% annual fee on a retirement portfolio is significantly above current industry standards, especially when combined with performance fees. Patricia set down her wine glass with a decisive clink. This is exactly why I asked for Sophia's perspective. You're getting valuable professional insights for free, Eleanor. Perhaps you should listen. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, but before she could respond, our entrees arrived. The timing allowed a natural pause in the increasingly tense conversation. As we began eating, I noticed my father watching me with a thoughtful expression, I couldn't quite interpret. After a few minutes of more general conversation about the food, he spoke. Sophia, I've realized I've never actually asked you about the specific services you provide for your clients. Would you mind telling us a bit more about your practice? The question surprised me, not because it was unusual, but because it represented the first genuine interest my father had shown in the details of my work since I'd left law school. Always supportive in a passive way, he had nevertheless followed my mother's lead in treating my career as a temporary deviation from a more respectable path. Of course, I replied, carefully setting down my fork. My firm provides comprehensive financial planning and investment management for clients at various life stages. I specialize in creating personalized strategies that balance growth, security, and tax efficiency based on each client's specific goals and risk tolerance. And these clients trust you with their money? My mother's question could have been antagonistic, but her tone suggested actual curiosity beneath the skepticism. They do, I confirmed. I currently manage approximately $118 million in client assets. The table fell silent. Even my mother appeared taken aback by the figure. That's substantial, my father said finally. I had no idea your business had grown to that scale. It's taken time and consistent results, I acknowledged. Much of it has come through referrals from satisfied clients. My mother took a deliberate sip of her wine before responding. And what qualifies you to manage such significant amounts? Thomas has decades of experience and institutional backing. It was a fair question, despite her combative framing. In the past, I might have become defensive. Instead, I reached down for my portfolio case and set it on the empty chair beside me, not opening it yet, but keeping it accessible. I hold the same professional certifications as the advisors at firms like Harrington, certified financial planner, chartered financial analyst, and several specialized designations. I'm held to the same fiduciary standards and regulatory requirements. The difference is my business model and investment philosophy, which prioritize client outcomes over institutional profit margins. Meaning? Michael prompted. Meaning I maintain a low client-to-advisor ratio to ensure personalized service, use primarily low-cost investment vehicles rather than proprietary products with hidden fees, and structure my compensation to align with client success rather than transaction volume. Patricia nodded approvingly. Smart approach. Wish my advisor operated that way. And has this approach been successful? My father asked. For your clients, I mean. I allowed myself a small smile. Yes, over the past 5 years, my client portfolios have outperformed their relevant benchmarks by an average of 11% annually, after all fees. More importantly, my clients have consistently achieved their stated financial objectives, whether that's retirement readiness, education funding, or wealth preservation. Robert, my sister's husband who had been quiet throughout the meal, suddenly joined the conversation. Those are impressive numbers. The physicians' investment group at our hospital would be ecstatic with those returns. Who handles your back-office operations? Are you affiliated with a larger firm? I maintain complete independence, I explained, warming to the subject now that genuine interest had replaced skepticism. I partner with an independent custodian for security and regulatory compliance, but all investment decisions and client relationships are managed directly through my firm. So you're truly running your own show, Vanessa observed, a new respect in her voice. That's actually quite remarkable, Sophia. My mother had remained silent during this exchange, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice carefully controlled. You've clearly built something significant, more than I realized. Coming from her, this was the equivalent of effusive praise. I felt a warmth spread through me, not just pride in my accomplishments, but relief that she might finally be seeing me clearly. Thank you, I said simply. It hasn't been an easy path, but it's been the right one for me. Would you, my father began, then hesitated. Would you be willing to look at our financial situation, just to offer a second opinion? The request hung in the air between us. 5 years ago, even 1 year ago, I would have leapt at this opening, desperate for their approval, eager to prove my worth. Now, I felt something different, professional confidence tempered with personal compassion. I'd be happy to, I said, but with two important understandings. First, I would approach this as I would any client situation, with complete professionalism and confidentiality. Second, I would provide my assessment honestly, even if my recommendations differ from what you're currently being advised. My father nodded immediately. That seems more than fair. My mother's agreement came more slowly, but it did come. I suppose a second perspective couldn't hurt, though I want to be clear that we've already committed to certain steps. I understand, I assured her. My role would simply be to provide information and options based on best practices and your specific circumstances. As the dinner continued, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but a fundamental change had occurred. The portfolio case beside me, brought to defend my own success, remained unopened. It wasn't necessary now. My expertise, demonstrated through measured explanation rather than defensive displays, had made a more compelling case than any statement of personal assets could have achieved. When dessert arrived, Aunt Patricia raised her glass in an impromptu toast. To new understandings and second opinions, and to Sophia, whose quiet determination has clearly paid off. Everyone raised their glasses, even my mother, though her smile remained reserved. For the first time in years, I felt seen by my family, not as a disappointment or a curiosity, but as a competent professional with valuable expertise to offer. As we prepared to leave the restaurant later that evening, my father pulled me aside while my mother settled the bill. I want you to know something, he said, his voice low and earnest. I've always been proud of you, Sophia. Your courage to forge your own path, even when it wasn't understood or appreciated. I should have said that years ago. His words touched something deep within me. Thank you, Dad. That means more than you know. Your mother struggles with anything outside her experience, he continued. But seeing you tonight, confident, knowledgeable, successful on your own terms, I think she's finally beginning to understand what you've built. He glanced at the portfolio case I still carried. Whatever's in there, whatever you brought, to show us. It matters less than what you've demonstrated just by being yourself tonight. His insight surprised me. How did you know I brought something to show? He smiled gently. You've always been prepared, Sophia. It's one of your strengths. But sometimes the most powerful statement isn't the one we plan, but the one we live. As we walked to our cars, my mother approached me directly, something she rarely did in family gatherings, preferring to communicate through others or in group settings. Her expression was serious but lacking its usual judgment. I've scheduled a meeting with Thomas for Wednesday morning, she said. Would you be available to join us? 9 o'clock. It was an invitation that would require rearranging. Client meetings, but its significance outweighed any inconvenience. I'll be there, I promised. Good, she nodded, then added with uncharacteristic hesitation. And perhaps afterward you could show me more about this business you've built. It seems I've underestimated what you've accomplished. In that moment, standing in the restaurant, parking lot with my unopened portfolio case in hand, I realized that the victory I'd sought wasn't about proving my financial success. It was about earning professional respect from the people whose opinion had once defined my self-worth. The portfolio statement remained important, not as a weapon or defense, but as a tool that might now help my family navigate their own financial challenges. I'd like that, I replied, meaning it sincerely. Very much. Wednesday morning arrived with unusual clarity for early spring. I'd spent the intervening days preparing, reviewing retirement planning best practices, researching the specific real estate development that had ensnared my parents' funds, and assembling a preliminary analysis based on the limited information I had. Professional thoroughness was my standard approach with clients, but this situation carried additional weight. This wasn't just any client meeting. This was an opportunity to potentially transform my relationship with my parents while genuinely helping them secure their financial future. I arrived at Harrington Financial 15 minutes early, dressed in my most authoritative charcoal suit with a burgundy silk blouse. The firm occupied 3 floors of a prestigious downtown tower, its reception area designed to impress with leather seating, original artwork, and panoramic city views. Everything about the space conveyed a deliberate message: established, traditional, exclusive. I understood immediately why my mother had been drawn to this environment. The receptionist, impeccably groomed and professionally distant, directed me to a waiting area. "Mr. Harrington is currently with your parents. I'll inform him you've arrived." I thanked her and took a seat, using the time to observe my surroundings more carefully. Behind the polished veneer of success, I noticed telling details that confirmed my concerns. Industry awards that were over a decade old, financial magazines that promoted conventional wisdom rather than innovative strategies, the subtle but unmistakable signs of a business resting on past reputation rather than current excellence. 10 minutes later, the receptionist escorted me to a corner conference room where my parents sat across from Thomas Harrington, a silver-haired man in his 60s wearing a custom suit and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The table between them was covered with glossy brochures and charts that I recognized as standard marketing materials designed to impress rather than inform. "Ah, Miss Reeves." Harrington rose and extended his hand. "Your parents mentioned you might join us. I understand you dabble in financial services yourself." The condescension was subtle but unmistakable. I smiled pleasantly as I shook his hand with firm pressure. "Sophia Reeves, CFP, CFA. I manage $118 million in client assets with a focus on retirement transition strategies and tax-optimized wealth preservation." His smile faltered slightly, reassessing. "Impressive for an independent operation. Small, boutique firms certainly have their place in the ecosystem." My mother watched this exchange with an unreadable expression, while my father nodded a silent greeting, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Thomas has been walking us through his recommended strategy," my mother explained as I took a seat beside them. "It's quite comprehensive." "I'd be interested to hear the details," I replied, setting my portfolio case on the table and removing a leather-bound notebook and pen, deliberately avoiding opening my laptop, which might have appeared confrontational. In this initial phase, Harrington smoothly shifted into presentation mode, explaining his proprietary approach to retirement security with practiced eloquence. As he spoke, I took careful notes, identifying the concerning elements beneath his polished delivery: high-fee investment products, complex annuity structures with substantial surrender penalties, and a liquidation strategy that prioritized assets with the lowest tax impact rather than the optimal long-term growth potential. Most troubling was his casual dismissal of my parents' frozen real estate investment. "Some losses are simply part of the investment journey," he explained with rehearsed empathy. "Better to accept the setback and restructure around it than to chase a problematic asset." When he finished his presentation, he turned to me with professional courtesy. "I'm sure this aligns with many of the fundamentals you employ in your practice, though perhaps at a more sophisticated scale than you typically handle." It was a perfect opening. Instead of responding defensively, I addressed my parents directly. "Would you mind if I asked Mr. Harrington some clarifying questions about his recommendations?" My father nodded immediately. "Please do." "Of course," my mother added, her typical certainty now tempered with what appeared to be genuine curiosity about how I would handle this situation. I turned to Harrington with professional courtesy. Your approach certainly covers the fundamental bases. I'm particularly interested in the fee structure you've outlined. The 2% annual management fee plus performance incentives is significantly above industry standards for retirement accounts. What specific value adds justify this? Premium pricing? His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Our clients pay for unparalleled expertise and institutional knowledge developed over decades. The performance incentives ensure our interests align with client outcomes. I see. And could you share the average annual returns for your retirement clients over the past 5 years, net of all fees? This was a standard question that any financial professional should be prepared to answer transparently. Harrington's momentary hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Our returns are competitive within our peer group, he replied smoothly. Of course, every client portfolio is customized to their unique situation, making broad comparisons potentially misleading. Understandable, I nodded. Perhaps you could share the specific projected returns you're anticipating for my parents' restructured portfolio, accounting for all fees and taxes. He shuffled through his materials, producing a chart with impressively ascending lines. We project annualized growth of approximately 8% to 3%, depending on market conditions. And that's after subtracting your fee structure? I asked, knowing the answer. The projections account for standard market fluctuations and management considerations, he evaded. I turned to my parents. For context, a standard index-based retirement portfolio with appropriate risk adjustments for your life stage would historically return approximately 6% to 7%, with fees under 5% annually. The difference between a 5% fee and a 2% fee may sound minimal, but compounds dramatically over time. My father leaned forward. How dramatically? In a simplified example, $500,000 growing at 7% annually for 20 years becomes approximately $9 million with a 5% fee, but only $5 million with a 2% fee. That's $400,000 in lost retirement funds, nearly the equivalent of your original investment. My mother's expression shifted from skepticism to concern. Is that accurate, Thomas? Harrington's professional demeanor remained intact, but his tone cooled noticeably. These hypothetical comparisons oversimplify the sophisticated strategies we employ. Our approach provides protection against downside risk that simple index investing doesn't account for. That's a valid consideration, I acknowledged. Risk management is certainly crucial for retirement portfolios. Could you elaborate on your specific downside protection mechanisms and their historical effectiveness during market corrections? Again, his response was vague, citing proprietary methods and general principles rather than concrete evidence. I maintained a respectful, collaborative tone throughout this exchange, careful not to create an adversarial dynamic. This wasn't about embarrassing Harrington or proving my superior knowledge. It was about ensuring my parents had the information necessary to make truly informed decisions about their financial future. After several more targeted questions that revealed similar gaps between promises and specifics, I shifted to the real estate investment issue. I'm curious about your recommendation to simply write off the development project investment. Have you explored options for recovering those funds, either through secondary market sales, legal remedies, or direct negotiation with the developers? Harrington's practiced smile thinned further. Those approaches rarely yield meaningful results and often create additional expenses and complications. Actually, I countered gently, I've helped 3 clients in similar situations over the past 2 years, achieving recovery rates between 65% and 82% of their original investments through strategic intervention. My mother's eyebrows rose. You didn't mention this possibility before, Thomas. Each situation is unique, he deflected. Without knowing the specific details of these other cases, comparisons can be misleading. I opened my portfolio case for the first time, removing a slim folder. I took the liberty of researching the Westlake Development Group that's managing your project. They have 3 other properties in similar situations, all currently in negotiation with investor groups for structured buyouts. There's an established pattern here that suggests recovery potential. My father accepted the folder I offered, examining the contents with academic thoroughness. This is remarkably detailed research, Sophia. How did you compile this so quickly? I have access to specialized databases for exactly these scenarios, I explained. And I've developed relationships with attorneys who specialize in investor advocacy. As my father reviewed the information, I noticed my mother watching me, with an expression I hadn't seen directed toward me in years, something approaching respect. This meeting has been enlightening, she said finally, addressing both Harrington and me. Thomas, we appreciate your time and recommendations, but I believe we need to reconsider our options before proceeding. Harrington recognized the shift, immediately his professional mask momentarily slipping to reveal frustration before recovering. Of course, financial decisions should never be rushed. Perhaps we could schedule a follow-up once you've had time to process today's discussion. Perhaps, my mother replied noncommittally. As we prepared to leave, Harrington made a final attempt to reassert his expertise, addressing me directly. Your dedication to your parents' situation is admirable, Miss Reeves. When you've been in this business as long as I have, you develop an instinct for which battles are worth fighting. Sometimes accepting losses and moving forward is the wisest course. I met his gaze steadily. In my experience, Mr. Harrington, the battles most worth fighting are the ones where someone has been underestimated. Outside the building, standing in the spring sunshine, an unexpected moment of awkwardness descended. For years, our family interactions had followed predictable patterns. This new dynamic, me as professional equal rather than perpetual disappointment, had no established script. My father broke the silence first. That was illuminating. Indeed, my mother agreed, her tone more measured than I'd ever heard when discussing my career. You were remarkably well prepared, Sophia. It's what I do every day, I replied simply, though usually without the personal connection. That folder you brought, my father said, tapping the research I'd provided. You put this together just for us, didn't you? In less than 48 hours. I nodded. It's the same level of diligence I apply for all my clients. The difference is that most clients come to me specifically seeking this expertise. My mother adjusted her scarf, a gesture I recognized as her way of processing unexpected information. You mentioned having helped other clients recover funds from stalled developments. Is that truly possible in our situation? It would require investigation and likely some legal assistance, but yes, I believe it's possible, I confirmed. At minimum, you should understand all your options before accepting a total loss. She nodded slowly. And what would you charge for handling something like this? The question revealed how much remained unresolved between us. Even now, she assumed my primary motivation would be financial gain rather than genuine desire to help. Nothing, I said firmly. You're my parents. I would never charge family for my professional assistance. A complex emotion crossed her face. Perhaps shame at having asked, perhaps surprise at my response. That hardly seems fair to you. This would clearly require significant effort. It would, I acknowledged. But some things matter more than billable hours. Your financial security is one of them. My father placed a hand on my shoulder, a rare gesture of physical affection from him. We've underestimated you, Sophia. For years, I'm afraid. The simple acknowledgement, spoken without qualification or defense, loosened something that had been tight within me for as long as I could remember. Not just in the 5 years since I'd changed career paths, but throughout my life as the daughter, who never quite fit the family's expectations. Perhaps, my mother added unexpectedly, we've been measuring success by the wrong metrics all along. Coming from her, the arbiter of conventional achievement in our family, this statement represented a seismic shift. I didn't trust myself to respond immediately, too caught between surprise and sudden emotion. "Would you have time for coffee?" she continued, gesturing toward a cafe across the street. "I'd like to hear more about these options you mentioned, and perhaps about your business as well. It seems there's much I've failed to understand." The invitation was awkwardly offered but genuinely meant. I could see that in her uncharacteristic uncertainty, the slight vulnerability in her expression. "I'd like that," I said, realizing with surprise that I truly meant it. As we crossed the street together, I felt the weight of my portfolio case in a new way. It no longer represented a defense or a challenge, but a bridge, a means of connecting my professional expertise with my family relationship in a way I'd never thought possible. What had begun as a mission to prove my worth through financial success had transformed into something far more valuable: the opportunity to help my parents while establishing a new foundation for our relationship, one built on mutual respect rather than unmet expectations. The coffee shop awaited, neutral ground for what felt like a new beginning. The cafe offered a welcome contrast to Harrington Financial's intimidating formality. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating exposed brick walls and wooden tables. The gentle hum of conversation and the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee created an atmosphere conducive to genuine dialogue rather than defensive positioning. We found a quiet corner table, my mother selecting a chair with a clear view of the entire space, her habitual preference for maintaining awareness of her surroundings. My father settled beside her, while I sat across from them, placing my portfolio case on an empty chair rather than prominently on the table. Its role had evolved from planned evidence to potential resource. After ordering espresso for my mother, black coffee for my father, a cappuccino for me, an unusual silence settled between us. For perhaps the first time in my adult life, our familiar family script had been disrupted, leaving all three of us without predetermined roles to play. "That meeting was not what I expected," my mother finally said, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her espresso cup. "Thomas came highly recommended by several university trustees." "I'm sure he did," I replied carefully. "His approach is very appealing to traditional institutions. It's familiar and reassuring, especially to those who established their careers before the significant changes in financial services over the past 15 years. "You're saying we're outdated," my mother observed, though without her usual defensiveness. "Not at all," I corrected. "I'm saying the financial industry has evolved dramatically, but many established professionals have a vested interest in maintaining traditional approaches that are more profitable for them than for their clients." My father leaned forward. "How exactly did you build your business, Sophia? We know so little about your professional journey." The genuine interest in his question touched me. For years, conversations about my career had been perfunctory at best, confrontational at worst. Never had either parent asked about the actual development of my practice with sincere curiosity. It wasn't a straight path, I admitted. After leaving law school, I initially took a position with Lambert Wealth Management, a traditional firm not unlike Harrington. I spent 2 years there, earned my certifications, and learned the business from the inside. "I remember," my mother nodded. "We thought that was at least a respectable compromise." "It was valuable experience," I acknowledged, but I quickly realized the firm's priorities often conflicted with what was truly best for clients. The pressure to sell proprietary products, the emphasis on acquiring new clients rather than serving existing ones effectively. It all felt fundamentally misaligned with why I'd entered the field. "So, you left," my father stated simply. "Not immediately. First, I tried to implement changes from within. I developed alternative strategies that produced better client outcomes while still generating reasonable firm profits. I presented research, showing how a more client-centered approach could actually increase long-term revenue through referrals and retention." "I'm guessing that wasn't well received," my father said with a small smile. "My direct supervisor actually called it naively idealistic," I confirmed. That was the moment I knew I needed to create something different. Our drinks arrived, providing a natural pause in the conversation. I watched my parents exchange a glance, one of those wordless communications developed over decades of marriage. Something was shifting between us, a recalibration of perception. "Starting your own firm must have been daunting," my mother observed, surprising me with her insight into the challenges I'd faced. "Terrifying," I admitted with a small laugh. I had my certifications, but limited capital and no established client base. Grandfather's inheritance became my seed funding, allowing me to lease a small office and develop my initial business infrastructure. At the mention of my grandfather, my mother's expression softened unexpectedly. "He always believed in you unequivocally, even when we questioned your choices." This acknowledgement of their doubt, and my grandfather's contrasting faith, was perhaps the closest my mother had ever come to acknowledging that her perspective might have been limited. "His belief meant everything," I said quietly. "But even more valuable was his understanding that financial success isn't just about numbers. It's about aligning resources with genuine human needs and values." My father nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like him. He built his business on relationships as much as transactions." "Exactly. And that became the foundation of my approach." I took a sip of my cappuccino, organizing my thoughts. I started with just 3 clients, former Lambert clients who were dissatisfied with their service and willing to take a chance on me. I worked 18-hour days, handling everything from investment strategy to administrative tasks. "That doesn't sound sustainable," my mother observed with surprising perception. "It wasn't," I agreed. "But it allowed me to demonstrate what was possible with a truly client-centered approach." Those 3 initial clients referred friends and colleagues. After 9 months, I had enough consistent revenue to hire a part-time assistant. By the 18-month mark, I was managing $15 million in assets and had developed my core investment methodology. "And now $118 million, my father said, genuine admiration in his voice. "That's remarkable growth in just 5 years." "The growth accelerated as results became evident," I explained. Word spread, particularly among professionals approaching retirement who were dissatisfied with traditional advisory services. They appreciated my transparency, fee structure, and willingness to coordinate with their other advisors rather than trying to control everything. My mother, who had been listening intently, asked a question that revealed how carefully she'd been paying attention during the Harrington meeting. "You mentioned a much lower fee structure than Thomas proposed. How do you maintain profitability with those reduced rates?" It was exactly the kind of practical business question that showed she was finally seeing my work as a legitimate enterprise, rather than a misguided experiment. "Operational efficiency and technology integration," I explained. "Traditional firms are burdened with bloated administrative structures and outdated systems. By building a streamlined practice from the ground up, I can deliver superior service at lower cost. Additionally, I don't maintain expensive showcase offices or spend excessively on marketing. Most of my new clients come through referrals." "And your investment approach?" my father inquired. "You mentioned index funds earlier, but surely there's more to your strategy." "Core and satellite," I explained, slipping comfortably into the professional expertise I rarely got to share with family. "The foundation is low-cost, broadly diversified index funds providing market exposure across multiple asset classes." Around that core, I add strategic positions based on valuation metrics, macroeconomic trends, and client-specific objectives, all while maintaining strict risk parameters. As I spoke, I noticed something unexpected in my mother's expression. Not just comprehension, but recognition. "That sounds similar to what Richard practiced in his personal investments," she said thoughtfully, referring to my grandfather by name. He was always skeptical of what he called financial showmanship. "He influenced my approach significantly," I acknowledged, touched that she had made the connection. "He understood that financial success comes from disciplined strategy and patience, not dramatic maneuvers or exclusive access." "Is that what you discuss with your clients?" my father asked. "This philosophy of measured growth rather than spectacular returns?" "Absolutely. Setting realistic expectations is crucial to successful client relationships. I focus on helping people understand what's genuinely achievable and necessary for their specific situation, rather than chasing arbitrary performance benchmarks that often lead to excessive risk-taking." My mother nodded slowly, a new respect evident in her expression. "And this approach, could it help with our situation, realistically?" The directness of her question, free from skepticism or challenge, marked a profound shift in our dynamic. For the first time, she was approaching me as a professional whose expertise might have genuine value for her own circumstances. "Yes," I said confidently. "Based on what I've learned so far, I believe we can develop a strategy that addresses both the immediate liquidity needs and long-term sustainability of your retirement plan. It would require some difficult decisions, but not necessarily selling your home if that's not what you truly want." "What would you need from us to develop this strategy?" my father asked. "Complete financial transparency," I replied honestly. "I would need to see everything: account statements, tax returns, insurance policies, property deeds, the full documentation on the troubled real estate investment. Only with comprehensive information can I create a truly effective plan." My mother hesitated, decades of privacy instincts visibly conflicting with the practical need for assistance. That level of disclosure feels uncomfortable. "I understand," I assured her. "Financial privacy is deeply ingrained, especially in your generation. But think of it like medical treatment. A doctor can't provide effective care without a complete understanding of your health history and current symptoms." My father reached over to cover my mother's hand with his own. "Eleanor, I think we need to trust Sophia with this. She's demonstrated expertise we clearly need, and she's family. Her interests are aligned with ours in a way no outside advisors could be." The silent communication passed between them again, a marriage-long conversation conducted entirely through subtle expressions and small gestures. Finally, my mother nodded. "Very well," she said with characteristic decisiveness once her mind was made up. "When can we begin?" "I have client meetings for the remainder of today," I explained. "But I could come to the house tomorrow afternoon. We could start gathering documentation and discussing priorities." "Tomorrow, then," my father confirmed. 3:00? As we finished our coffee and prepared to leave, my mother asked one final question, one that revealed how significantly our interaction had shifted. "The portfolio case," she said, nodding toward it. "You brought it to the dinner last week and to Harrington's office today, but you've barely referenced it. What's inside that you considered so important to have? With you?" I smiled, recognizing the perfect closing to our conversation. Originally, it contained documentation of my personal financial success, portfolio statements, growth metrics, client statistics. I brought it to the dinner thinking I might need to defend my career choice with concrete evidence. "And now?" she prompted. "Now I realize that true professional validation doesn't come from displaying achievements, but from applying expertise to help others. The case still contains those documents, but they've become far less important than what we've discussed today." My mother studied me for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. I've been measuring you against the wrong standards, haven't I? The question, rhetorical yet profound, hung in the air between us. Instead of answering directly, I responded with gentle honesty. We all use the measuring tools we know best. You valued security, prestige, and traditional definitions of success because they provided stability in your own life. I needed to find different parameters that aligned with my strengths and values. Well, she said, rising from her chair with characteristic poise, it seems your parameters have proven remarkably effective. Perhaps it's time I adjusted mine. As we walked together toward the parking area, I felt the weight of the portfolio, case in my hand, no longer a shield or weapon, but simply a professional tool among many. Its contents remained unchanged, but its significance had transformed completely. Tomorrow would bring practical challenges, untangling my parents' financial situation, developing viable recovery strategies, rebuilding retirement security. But the most difficult barrier had already been overcome, the recognition that success takes many forms and that expertise can emerge from unexpected directions. In questioning Thomas Harrington's advice, I had proven my professional worth not through assertion but through demonstration. In offering help without expectation of compensation, I had shown that my commitment to family transcended business considerations. And in maintaining professional composure throughout, I had finally earned the respect I'd sought for so long. As we reached our separate vehicles, my mother did something unprecedented. She initiated a brief but genuine embrace. "Thank you, Sophia," she said simply, "for seeing what we couldn't." Driving away, I realized that the portfolio statement I'd brought to prove my worth had never been opened. It hadn't needed to be. The true measure of professional success wasn't contained in account balances or performance metrics, but in the capacity to create meaningful impact through knowledge skillfully applied. The $850,000 in my personal portfolio remained significant, evidence of my investment principles effectively implemented. But far more valuable was the transformation of relationship that had begun in a high-end restaurant, continued in a corporate conference room, and culminated in a sunlit cafe where, for perhaps the first time, my mother had seen me clearly for who I had become rather than who she had expected me to be. The following afternoon, I arrived at my parents' house precisely at 3 o'clock, carrying my professional laptop and an expandable file organizer. The familiar two-story colonial looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood, meticulously. Maintained gardens, freshly painted trim, the brass knocker gleaming in the spring sunshine. For decades, this house had represented both home and a subtle source of judgment, the place where my life choices were invariably found wanting against the backdrop of family expectations. Today, I approached it differently, not as the perpetual disappointment returning to family territory, but as a financial professional arriving to provide specialized expertise. This shift in perspective transformed the familiar walk up the curved front path into something completely new. My father answered the door before I could knock, welcoming me with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. "Right on time," he nodded approvingly, stepping aside to let me enter. "We've been gathering documents since morning." The living room had been transformed into an impromptu workspace. The coffee table was covered with neatly stacked folders, each labeled in my mother's precise handwriting. Tax returns, investment statements, insurance policies, property records, all organized chronologically, color-coded by category. "Your mother's organizational skills are impressive," I observed, setting down my laptop case. "Always have been," my father agreed with affectionate pride. "She was the department administrator before becoming a professor. The history department ran like clockwork under her management." I hadn't known this detail about my mother's early career, a reminder of how much family history remained unexplored between us, despite decades of shared lives. Before I could comment further, my mother entered from the kitchen carrying a tray, with coffee, and her special lemon cookies that had marked important family occasions throughout my childhood. "I thought we might need sustenance," she explained, setting down the tray. "This looks to be substantial work." The gesture, seemingly small but deeply meaningful within our family context, touched me unexpectedly. These cookies had appeared at celebrations, academic achievements, life milestones. Their presence now signaled that my mother considered this professional consultation worthy of the tradition, a subtle but significant acknowledgement. "Thank you," I said simply, accepting both the coffee and the unspoken recognition. We settled. Around the coffee table, my laptop open and ready as I began to explain the process. Financial assessment requires both quantitative analysis, the raw numbers, and qualitative understanding of your goals, priorities, and comfort with various approaches. We'll need to cover both. My mother nodded, her posture straight, hands folded in her lap, the same composed demeanor she'd maintained through countless faculty meetings and academic presentations. "Where would you like to begin?" "Let's start with the complete picture," I suggested. "Could you walk me through your current assets, liabilities, income sources, and expenses?" "The documents will provide details, but I'd like to hear your understanding of your financial situation first." My father glanced at my mother, receiving her slight nod before beginning. "We have this house, purchased 35 years ago, fully paid off, currently valued around $780,000 according to recent appraisals. Our retirement accounts totaled approximately $2 million before the real estate investment situation, which took $720,000, my mother added, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "Nearly 60% of our retirement savings, as we mentioned before." I made careful notes, keeping my expression professional rather than revealing my shock at the magnitude of their exposure to a single investment. No reputable financial advisor would have recommended concentrating such a large percentage of retirement assets in an illiquid, high-risk venture. "The remaining retirement funds are primarily in university-sponsored accounts," my father continued. "About $480,000 total across various vehicles. My pension provides $5,200 monthly, and we have Social Security, of course, together about $3,800 monthly." "Any other significant assets?" I asked. "Some artwork and antiques," my mother replied. "Perhaps $120,000 total if liquidated, though we'd prefer not to sell family pieces unless absolutely necessary. And I have a small inheritance from my aunt, approximately $95,000 in municipal bonds." "Liabilities?" "Minimal," my father said. "We've always avoided debt. Just normal monthly expenses, utilities, insurance, property taxes, daily living costs. We budget about $7,500 monthly for everything, which our current income covers, but with limited flexibility for emergencies or special expenses." As they continued detailing their financial situation, I developed a clearer understanding of their position. Without the real estate investment problem, they would have been in excellent financial condition for retirement, not wealthy by conventional standards, but secure and comfortable. The frozen investment had transformed sufficiency into vulnerability, disrupting well-laid plans and creating both practical concerns and emotional distress. After documenting their verbal overview, I began examining the actual financial records, methodically working through statements and documents while asking targeted questions. My parents answered with increasing openness, revealing details they would likely never have shared before our conversation at the cafe. When I reached the folder containing the troubled real estate investment documentation, I slowed my pace, reviewing each page with heightened attention. What I found confirmed my suspicions, but also revealed potential recovery avenues. "This prospectus contains several concerning elements," I noted, highlighting specific sections. The projected returns were extraordinarily optimistic compared to industry standards for similar developments. The fee structures are unusually complex, with multiple layers of management compensation, and the developer disclosure section omits several required risk warnings. My father leaned forward, academic curiosity engaged. Are these legal issues or just aggressive marketing? Potentially both, I replied. These omissions and projections skirt the edge of securities violations. They're deliberately designed to present minimal risk while promising exceptional returns, precisely the combination that experienced investors should recognize as unrealistic. Are you suggesting we were naive? My mother's question contained a hint of her former defensiveness. Not at all, I assured her. These materials were professionally crafted to appeal specifically to sophisticated, educated individuals like yourselves. The developers understood that academic professionals value data and detailed projections, so they provided impressive-looking analytics without the contextual understanding needed to evaluate them properly. Targeted marketing, my father nodded, understanding dawning. Like academic publishers who know exactly which features will appeal to university libraries, justifying premium pricing. Exactly. They identified their audience and tailored their presentation accordingly. I turned to my mother. You mentioned Thomas Harrington dismissed recovery options. Based on what I'm seeing here, that dismissal was premature at best. My mother's expression sharpened with interest. What options do you see? Several promising avenues, I explained, shifting into solution mode. First, there's evidence here of potential securities violations that could support legal action. Second, this development is part of a larger portfolio where other properties are moving forward, suggesting selective fund allocation that might constitute breach of fiduciary duty. Third, there's an emerging secondary market for distressed development interests where we might recover 60–70% of principal rather than writing off the entire investment. As I outlined these possibilities, I noticed both parents becoming gradually more engaged, not just with the financial details, but with the strategic thinking behind them. They asked intelligent questions, demonstrated quick comprehension of complex concepts, and showed the same analytical abilities that had made them successful in their academic careers. You've identified more options in an hour than Thomas suggested in multiple meetings, my father observed. Different perspective and specialized experience, I explained. This particular type of situation happens to align with expertise I've developed working with several clients in similar circumstances. After nearly 3 hours of detailed analysis, I closed my laptop and organized my notes. I have enough information now to develop a comprehensive recovery strategy and revised retirement plan. Would you be comfortable with me taking these documents to review more thoroughly at my office? Of course, my mother agreed without hesitation, a remarkable shift from her initial reluctance to share financial details. When might we expect your assessment? I'll need about a week to complete the full analysis and develop specific recommendations. But I can share some preliminary observations now if you'd like. They exchanged glances, then my father nodded. Please do. First, your overall financial foundation remains strong despite this setback. The house, pension, Social Security, and remaining retirement assets provide essential security. Second, there are viable paths to recovering a significant portion of the troubled investment, not immediately, but likely within 12–24 months. Third, even in a worst-case scenario where no recovery occurs, you could maintain your current lifestyle without selling the house by implementing strategic adjustments to your existing portfolio and spending patterns. The relief on both their faces was palpable. My mother, always more guarded with her emotions, nevertheless showed visible easing of the tension she'd carried throughout our discussion. That's considerably more optimistic than what we've been led to believe, she said carefully. It's realistic, not optimistic, I clarified. Based on verifiable figures and established recovery methods, not wishful thinking. There will be challenges and compromises required, but your situation is far from dire. As I packed up my materials, my father helped gather the documents I'd be taking, while my mother disappeared briefly into the kitchen. When she returned, she carried a small photo album I'd never seen before. "Before you go," she said, an unusual hesitancy in her voice, "there's something I'd like to show you." She opened the album to reveal newspaper clippings, certificates, and photographs, all related to my grandfather's business career. "Your grandfather kept these. After he passed, they came to me as executor of his estate. I should have shared them with you years ago." I accepted the album, surprised by its existence and my mother's decision to share it now. The yellowed clippings documented my grandfather's business journey, from opening his first hardware store to expanding regionally, weathering economic downturns, and eventually creating a successful chain that supported dozens of families through employment. "He was so proud of you," my mother said softly, indicating a photo in the corner. My grandfather and me at my college graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming. "He told me once that you had his business instincts, but much more brains to apply them. He saw something in you that I couldn't or wouldn't recognize." The admission, perhaps the most personal my mother had ever offered, created a lump in my throat that made immediate response impossible. I turned the pages slowly, absorbing this previously unknown connection between my grandfather and myself, preserved in fading newsprint and careful annotations in his distinctive handwriting. He believed entrepreneurship was as valuable as academia, my father added. We never fully appreciated that perspective. "Why are you showing me this now?" I finally asked. My mother's answer was characteristically direct. "Because I was wrong. About your career choice. About what constitutes meaningful work. About measuring success through conventional credentials rather than actual impact. Seeing you today, how thoroughly you understand this complex financial landscape, how clearly you communicate difficult concepts, how confidently you navigate challenging situations, I finally recognize what your grandfather saw years ago." Coming from my perpetually critical mother, this acknowledgement represented a seismic shift in our relationship. Not just acceptance, but genuine recognition of professional value on my own terms rather than hers. "Thank you," I said simply, knowing that elaborate response would only create mutual discomfort. "This means a great deal to me." As I prepared to leave, portfolio case in one hand and the precious album in the other, my father walked me to the door. "Your grandfather would be extraordinarily proud of how you've handled this situation," he said quietly. "Not just the financial expertise, but the grace with which you've offered it, despite years of underappreciation." The diplomatic phrasing made me smile. "Family relationships are complicated," I acknowledged, "but they can evolve when we allow ourselves to see each other clearly." Driving away from my childhood home, I felt a profound shift in my perception. The house that had represented judgment and inadequacy now seemed simply a place where three people with different values and perspectives had tried, imperfectly but genuinely, to understand each other across generational and philosophical divides. The portfolio case beside me contained the documentation of my financial success, the evidence I'd originally gathered to demand respect. The photo album on the passenger seat represented something far more valuable: recognition freely given, understanding genuinely achieved, and the confirmation that my grandfather's faith in my path had been justified all along. The victory wasn't that I'd proven my worth through financial achievement, though the $850,000 portfolio statement remained impressively tangible. The true triumph was that professional respect had finally emerged organically through demonstrated expertise rather than demanded acknowledgement. My parents had seen my capabilities not because I insisted they look, but because circumstances had created space for genuine observation. As I merged onto the highway toward my office, I realized that my mother's critical question at the family dinner, "You'll never amount to anything in finance. What a waste of potential," had finally been answered, not with defensive words or displayed bank statements, but with the quiet authority of competence in action and the unmistakable evidence of lives improved through knowledge skillfully applied. The portfolio statement that had once seemed so crucial as validation now represented something entirely different. Not proof of personal worth, but simply one of many tools available to help others secure their own financial well-being and peace of mind. Over the next week, I immersed myself in my parents' financial situation with professional thoroughness. My office became a command center of spreadsheets, legal research, and strategic planning. I approached their situation with the same focused dedication I applied to my highest-tier clients, perhaps even more, given the personal stakes involved. Between client meetings and regular business responsibilities, I analyzed recovery options for the troubled real estate investment, restructuring possibilities for their remaining assets, and sustainable withdrawal strategies to support their retirement lifestyle. Every evening, I worked late into the night, driven by a sense of purpose that transcended professional obligation or personal redemption. This was about providing genuine security for the people who had given me life, regardless of our complicated history. What emerged from this intensive analysis was a multi-layered strategy with both immediate interventions and long-term adjustments. The most promising recovery avenue involved joining forces with other investors in the troubled development, many of whom were similarly educated professionals who had been attracted by the same sophisticated marketing materials that had convinced my parents. Through my professional network, I located an attorney specializing in securities recovery who had already initiated contact with several affected investors. A class action approach would create leverage that individual investors couldn't achieve alone, while distributing legal costs across multiple parties. Initial discussions suggested potential recovery of 65-75% of principal, though over an 18-month timeline rather than immediately. Beyond this central recovery effort, I identified multiple portfolio adjustments that would enhance income while maintaining growth potential, tax optimization strategies they hadn't previously implemented, and specific expense management approaches that would preserve their quality of life while reducing unnecessary costs. After 7 days of intensive work, I compiled my findings into a comprehensive financial recovery plan, complete with detailed projections, contingency strategies, and clear implementation steps. I scheduled a presentation at my office rather than their home, a deliberate choice to reinforce the professional nature of our new relationship dynamic. When they arrived that Thursday afternoon, I welcomed them into my professional space for the first time. My office occupied the corner suite of a modern building in the financial district, not ostentatious, but unmistakably successful, with clean lines, professional artwork, and the subtle technology integration that characterized my business approach. "This is impressive, Sophia," my father commented, looking around with genuine interest. "Very different from academic offices." "Function with understated elegance," my mother observed, her natural attention to detail catching the thoughtful elements I'd incorporated into the space. Ergonomic furniture, acoustic panels for client privacy, a subtle color scheme that balanced professionalism with approachability. My assistant offered them refreshments before escorting us to the conference room where I'd prepared for our meeting. The large screen displayed my company logo, Reeves Financial Strategies, with a tagline that had taken months to perfect: "Building security through intelligent planning." Once settled, I began my presentation with the same professional approach I used with all clients, establishing context before moving to specific recommendations. After comprehensive analysis of your financial situation, I've developed a 3-phase strategy designed to accomplish several key objectives: recover maximum value from the troubled investment, optimize your remaining assets for both security and reasonable growth, and ensure sustainable retirement income without requiring home liquidation. As I moved through the presentation, I noticed both parents becoming increasingly engaged, not just with the content, but with my professional delivery. They asked insightful questions, took detailed notes, and demonstrated the same analytical rigor they applied to academic research. The dynamic between us had shifted dramatically from our traditional family roles to something more balanced. Mutual respect between professionals with different but complementary areas of expertise. When I reached the section on the troubled real estate investment, I presented 3 potential recovery approaches with transparent probability assessments and timeline projections for each. The class action approach offers the highest probable recovery percentage, though with a longer timeline, I explained, highlighting the relevant data. Initial discussions with the lead attorney suggest 65–75% recovery potential, which would return approximately $470,540,000 of your original investment. That's dramatically different from writing it off entirely, my father noted, his academic precision evident in how carefully he reviewed the supporting documentation. The legal approach has significantly higher recovery potential than Thomas suggested, I acknowledged, but I've also identified 2 additional paths worth pursuing simultaneously. I detailed these alternatives: a secondary market sale of their interest at a negotiated discount, and direct negotiation with the developer leveraging regulatory concerns, each offering different risk-reward profiles and timelines. By pursuing all 3 approaches in parallel, we maximize both recovery probability and potential percentage, I concluded. This creates a layered strategy rather than relying on a single recovery method. My mother, who had been studying the projections with characteristic thoroughness, looked up with newfound professional respect in her expression. "This is remarkably comprehensive, Sophia. You've identified more viable options in a week than we've heard in months of consultations." The compliment, delivered as a straightforward professional assessment rather than maternal praise, carried particular weight precisely because of its objective quality. This wasn't a mother's obligatory encouragement, but a highly intelligent professional's genuine recognition of quality work. As we moved to the portfolio restructuring section, I presented a reallocation strategy that maintained their conservative risk profile while improving projected returns through fee reduction and tax efficiency. By shifting from Harrington's high-fee proprietary funds to this optimized structure, we project annual fee savings of approximately $9,600 while potentially improving returns by 1.8% annually, I explained, the numbers speaking for themselves on the comparative chart. "That difference compounds dramatically over time," my father observed, his mathematician's mind quickly grasping the long-term implications. "Precisely. Over a 20-year retirement horizon, the combined impact of fee reduction and improved returns potentially represents over $200,000 in additional portfolio value, without changing your fundamental risk exposure." Throughout the presentation, I maintained professional distance, not cold or detached, but appropriately focused on the financial matters rather than our evolving family dynamic. This approach seemed to resonate particularly with my mother, who had always respected clear boundaries and professional demeanor. When we reached the implementation section, I outlined specific action steps with assigned responsibilities and timeline expectations. If you decide to proceed with this strategy, I would suggest beginning with these immediate actions. I indicated the first phase on the timeline: engaging the securities recovery attorney, implementing the initial portfolio adjustments, and establishing the recommended cash management system. Each element has been designed to function independently while complementing the overall strategy. As I concluded the formal presentation and opened the floor for questions, I noticed something unprecedented in my mother's expression. Not just approval or professional respect, but something approaching pride. It was subtle, contained within her naturally reserved demeanor, but unmistakably present. "You've clearly leveraged specialized expertise with impressive results," she said, her academic's precision evident in each carefully chosen word. "What would be the next steps if we decide to implement this strategy?" I've prepared engagement documents for both the recovery attorney and my firm, I explained, indicating the folders at the edge of the conference table. The attorney would work on contingency, no upfront fees, but 28% of any recovered amount. For my firm's services, I would suggest a different arrangement. Which is? My father prompted. No charge, I stated simply. While I would typically charge around $8,500 for developing a comprehensive strategy like this, plus ongoing management fees for implementation, I won't be charging for any services related to your financial situation. That's not appropriate. My mother objected immediately. Professional services warrant professional compensation. Her insistence on proper payment, rather than accepting familial assistance as entitlement, represented another significant shift in our relationship. This wasn't the maternal figure expecting sacrifice from a child, but a client recognizing the legitimate value of specialized expertise. I appreciate that perspective, I acknowledged, but this is a personal choice. I derive substantial professional satisfaction from helping you navigate this situation successfully, and that's compensation enough in this specific case. My father studied me thoughtfully. You're certain about this? Completely, I confirmed. Though I would suggest a compromise. Allow me to handle the implementation without charge, but consider making an equivalent donation to the university's first-generation scholarship fund. This suggestion visibly resonated with both of them, academics, who had dedicated their careers to educational advancement. It transformed my fee waiver from potential familial obligation to shared commitment to a meaningful cause. That's an excellent resolution, my mother nodded with approval. As we concluded the meeting and gathered materials, my father paused before standing. I've sat through countless academic presentations, departmental reviews, and professional symposia, he said reflectively. This ranks among the most thorough and well-structured I've encountered in any context. Coming from a lifelong educator with exacting standards, this represented the highest form of professional validation. Not extravagant praise, but measured recognition from someone qualified to assess quality. Thank you, I replied simply. That means a great deal coming from you. As I escorted them from the conference room, we passed my assistant's desk where a framed article hung discreetly on the wall, a feature from Financial Planning Journal highlighting Rising Stars Reshaping Retirement Strategies. My photo and profile appeared alongside 4 other emerging leaders in the financial planning industry. My mother paused, noticing it for the first time. You never mentioned this, she observed, studying the article with interest. It wasn't particularly significant in the larger context of our discussions, I explained, though in truth, I had once imagined showing her exactly this kind of professional recognition as proof of my success. She read the profile silently, her expression thoughtful. The article describes your approach as innovative yet grounded, combining technical expertise with exceptional interpersonal skills. That seems an accurate assessment based on what we've experienced. This simple acknowledgement, recognizing my professional qualities as they were described by objective industry observers, carried more meaningful validation than any reaction to financial statements or portfolio values could have provided. When did this appear? My father asked, adjusting his glasses to read the date. About 8 months ago, I replied, shortly after I was selected for the Industry Leadership Council. Which you also didn't mention, my mother noted, though without criticism. There's been limited opportunity for professional updates in our typical family interactions, I observed diplomatically. My mother nodded, accepting this gentle reminder of our previous communication patterns. Perhaps that's something we might change going forward, she suggested. I find I'm quite interested in understanding more about this world you've built. As we reached the building lobby, the conventional awkwardness of family goodbyes was replaced by something more formal, yet somehow warmer. the genuine appreciation between professionals who had collaborated effectively. "We'll review everything and contact you by Monday," my father said, extending his hand in a gesture that acknowledged our new professional dimension without diminishing our familial connection. "I'll be available whenever you're ready to discuss next steps," I assured them. My mother, typically reserved with physical affection, surprised me with a brief but genuine embrace. "Thank you, Sophia," she said quietly. "Not just for the financial strategy, but for showing us what we've been missing by not seeing you clearly all these years." As they departed, I returned to my office with a profound sense of professional fulfillment that transcended any previous achievement. The portfolio statement that had once seemed so essential as validation remained in my desk drawer, unopened and unreferenced throughout our entire interaction. Its contents, the $850,000 in personal assets I'd accumulated, still represented significant achievement, but now seemed almost incidental to the more meaningful success, creating genuine impact through professional expertise thoughtfully applied, and finally establishing a relationship with my parents based on mutual respect rather than persistent judgment. The financial recovery strategy I'd developed would likely restore most of their imperiled retirement security. But we had already recovered something perhaps more valuable: the possibility of connection based on who we actually were rather than who we had expected each other to be. Monday morning brought their decision via a joint email, formal in tone yet warmly appreciative in content. They had reviewed the strategy thoroughly, discussed it extensively over the weekend, and decided to move forward with full implementation. The email ended with a sentence that particularly resonated. "We find ourselves in the unexpected but welcome position of having our daughter's professional expertise become an essential resource in securing our future." This acknowledgement, framed not as capitulation or reluctant acceptance, but as genuine appreciation of value, represented the final transformation in our relationship. No longer was I the disappointing child who had abandoned a prestigious legal career for a dubious financial scheme. I had become a trusted advisor whose specialized knowledge offered solutions unavailable through conventional channels. Implementation began immediately. I arranged a conference call with the securities recovery attorney, who confirmed his interest in adding my parents to the developing class action. Their documentation provided additional evidence of potential securities violations, strengthening the collective case while increasing their individual recovery prospects. "These materials are particularly helpful," the attorney noted during our call. "The university connection gives us another common thread among affected investors, potentially suggesting targeted marketing to a specific demographic, which strengthens our regulatory concerns argument." My mother, listening intently, contributed valuable insights from her academic perspective. The recruitment approach resembled academic conference invitations, exclusive, peer-validated, suggesting insider knowledge. It deliberately leveraged academic credibility structures familiar to university professionals. Her observation, precise and perceptive, demonstrated how her analytical skills transferred effectively to this new context. The attorney immediately recognized the value of her insight, requesting permission to incorporate this framing into the developing case narrative. "This is exactly the kind of perspective that strengthens our position," he confirmed. "The deliberate exploitation of academic validation systems to circumvent normal investment skepticism." Throughout the call, I observed my parents engaging as intellectual equals rather than bewildered victims, applying their considerable analytical abilities to a situation that had previously left them feeling powerless and embarrassed. The simple act of participating actively in the recovery process had already begun restoring their confidence, regardless of the ultimate financial outcome. Portfolio restructuring proceeded concurrently. I scheduled a meeting with my parents' existing financial institutions, accompanying them as their authorized representative. My professional credentials and prepared documentation streamlined what could have been a cumbersome process, transforming potentially intimidating financial adjustments into a clearly managed transition. When the bank representative raised questions about certain allocation changes, my father deferred to me with natural ease. My daughter specializes in retirement transition strategies. She can explain the rationale behind these adjustments better than I could. The simple introduction, delivered without qualification or explanation, demonstrated how completely he had embraced my professional identity. Not my daughter who used to be in law school, or my daughter who works in finance, but a straightforward acknowledgement of specialized expertise that he respected enough to rely upon publicly. Throughout the implementation phase, I maintained careful documentation of each step, creating a transparent record that allowed my parents to follow progress across multiple recovery fronts. Weekly update meetings became a new ritual. Thursday afternoons at my office, where we reviewed developments, addressed emerging questions, and adjusted strategies as needed. These meetings evolved into something neither purely professional nor traditionally familial, but a productive hybrid that honored both dimensions of our relationship. My mother might transition seamlessly from discussing tax loss harvesting strategies to sharing news about my brother's daughter or my sister's recent medical conference presentation. My father would analyze investment allocation percentages with mathematical precision before mentioning an interesting book he thought I might enjoy. 3 weeks into implementation, we received the first tangible victory: notification that the developer had approached the attorney representing the investor group with an initial settlement offer. They're offering 58% of principal, I explained during our update meeting, presenting the formal communication. The attorney recommends rejecting this initial proposal based on the strength of our collective position and his assessment of their increasing legal exposure. What percentage do you believe is ultimately achievable? My mother asked, her question reflecting both pragmatic acceptance of partial recovery and determination to maximize results. Based on similar cases and the specific circumstances here, I believe 70-75% remains a realistic target, I replied. Their opening offer suggests they recognize significant liability exposure. They're testing resolve rather than making their best offer. My father nodded thoughtfully. In academic publishing negotiations, initial offers are typically 30-40% below eventual settlement points. This pattern seems similar. Exactly comparable, I confirmed. They expect counteroffers and have built negotiating margin into their position. The attorney suggests a coordinated response from all affected investors. Polite rejection accompanied by evidence of continued legal preparation. This maintains pressure without closing dialogue. As we discussed strategy refinements, I noticed my mother studying me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, not her former critical assessment, but something more contemplative. You genuinely enjoy this work, she observed during a brief lull in our tactical discussion. It's not just technical capability. You find satisfaction in creating solutions to complex problems. The comment, perceptive and unexpectedly personal, amid our otherwise business-focused meeting, caught me by surprise. I do, I acknowledged, particularly when the solutions create meaningful impact for people facing difficult situations. I see that now, she said quietly. When you left law for finance, I assumed you were seeking easier work or faster money. I didn't recognize that you might have found a better match for your particular abilities and temperament. This admission, that she had misjudged not just my career prospects, but my motivations, represented perhaps the most significant shift in our relationship. Not merely acknowledging my success, but recognizing the authentic alignment between my character and chosen field. Law never felt quite right, I explained, allowing myself a rare moment of personal reflection during our otherwise professional interaction. The adversarial structure, the focus on precedent rather than innovation, It didn't energize me the way financial problem-solving does. Your grandfather was the same, my father contributed unexpectedly. He told me once that he started his hardware business because he loved finding practical solutions to everyday problems. The business success was secondary to that fundamental satisfaction. This connection to my grandfather's motivational legacy, offered freely rather than as comparison or criticism, touched me deeply. The portfolio case containing evidence of my financial success sat unused in my office credenza, while this more meaningful validation emerged through genuine understanding of my professional character. As implementation progressed through subsequent weeks, results accumulated across multiple fronts. The portfolio restructuring immediately reduced fees and improved tax efficiency. The class action gained momentum as additional investors joined, strengthening collective leverage. Direct negotiations. With the developer established a secondary recovery channel, running parallel to the legal approach. 6 weeks into implementation, we reached a significant milestone, official notification that my parents could remain in their home based on the revised financial projections, even with conservative recovery estimates from the troubled investment. The adjusted cash flow analysis confirmed sustainable withdrawal rates without home liquidation, I explained, presenting the updated projections. Your combined pension, Social Security, and optimized portfolio income should maintain your current lifestyle with appropriate inflation adjustments through your projected life expectancy, plus a reasonable safety margin. The relief on both? Their faces transcended financial considerations, touching something more fundamental about identity and continuity. This wasn't just any house, it was the physical embodiment of their life's work and family history. Preserving it represented maintaining connection to their established sense of self during a period of significant transition. This alone justifies the entire process, my father said quietly, studying the projections with careful attention to detail. His way of processing emotional significance through analytical engagement. Indeed, my mother agreed, her characteristic reserve softening momentarily. Though the process itself has provided unexpected value beyond financial recovery. How so? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. It's created space for recalibration, she explained thoughtfully. Not just of our retirement expectations, but of family dynamics that had calcified into unproductive patterns. Sometimes disruption becomes the necessary catalyst for meaningful adjustment. Coming from my traditionally change-resistant mother, this philosophical observation represented remarkable evolution. The financial crisis that had initially seemed purely negative had created opportunity for growth that might otherwise never have emerged. As our implementation meeting concluded, my mother mentioned an unexpected development. We've been invited to speak at next month's pre-retirement faculty workshop, she explained. The planning committee thought our experience might provide valuable perspective for colleagues approaching similar transitions. What perspective will you share? I asked, intrigued by how they would frame their experience. The importance of questioning conventional wisdom about retirement planning, my father replied. Particularly the value of seeking diverse expertise, rather than relying solely on traditional advisors. We'd like you to join us, my mother added. Not to promote your business specifically, but to help address technical questions that might arise. Your professional perspective would add significant value to the discussion. The invitation represented unprecedented public acknowledgement of my expertise, not just privately within family conversation, but openly within their professional community. This wasn't grudging acceptance, but active promotion of my professional identity among their academic colleagues. I'd be honored to participate, I replied sincerely. As they prepared to leave, my father paused by my office bookshelf, where a small framed photograph had recently appeared among my professional credentials and industry recognition. The image showed 3 generations: my grandfather in his hardware, store apron, my father in his professor's blazer with elbow patches, and me in my graduation gown, arms linked in a rare moment of uncomplicated family connection. "When was this taken?" he asked, studying it with evident surprise. "The day I received my undergraduate degree," I replied. "Before law school, before career decisions became contentious." "I don't remember seeing this particular shot," he commented. "Grandfather had it in his study. I found it when sorting through some of his papers recently." My mother joined him, examining the photograph with uncharacteristic emotional openness. "3 generations of different paths," she observed softly, "each valuable in its own way. The simple acknowledgement that different professional choices could hold equal merit encapsulated the fundamental transformation in our relationship. No longer was there a hierarchy of acceptable careers with my chosen path relegated to inferior status. Instead, there was recognition of diverse but equally legitimate approaches to creating meaningful impact. As we walked toward the elevator, our conversation shifted to dinner arrangements for the following week. My brother and his family would be visiting, creating opportunity for the first full family gathering since our relationship recalibration had begun. "Michael's quite interested in hearing about the recovery strategy," my father mentioned. "He's been following our progress with considerable interest." "And your sister called specifically to ask about your role in resolving the situation," my mother added. "I believe she's developing new appreciation for your expertise as well." This organic expansion of my professional recognition beyond my parents to include my academically accomplished siblings represented the final dimension of transformation. The portfolio case that had once seemed so essential for proving my worth remained unopened and unreferenced, its contents rendered irrelevant by the more meaningful validation of demonstrated value through applied expertise. As the elevator arrived and they stepped inside, my mother paused, holding the door momentarily. "You know," she said with unexpected directness, "success looks different than I imagined it would for you. But I'm beginning to think your version might be the more authentic achievement." The doors closed before I could respond, but her words remained, a perfect distillation of our journey from judgment to understanding. My $850,000 portfolio statement, the financial evidence I'd originally brought to defend my choices, had never been revealed. Yet something far more valuable had been disclosed: the genuine alignment between my authentic self and chosen profession, recognized at last by those whose validation I had sought for so long. Walking back to my office, I realized that my mother's devastating question at that fateful family dinner, "You'll never amount to anything in finance. What a waste of potential," had received its definitive answer, not through displayed bank statements or defensive arguments, but through the undeniable evidence of lives improved through expertise thoughtfully applied. The portfolio case could now be permanently retired from its defensive role. Its contents remained significant as personal achievement, but had been transcended by the more meaningful success of finally being seen clearly, not as a disappointment who had abandoned a prestigious path, but as a professional who had found her authentic calling and excelled within it on her own terms. 2 months after implementing our financial recovery strategy, the results were exceeding even my optimistic projections. The class action had gained momentum as additional investors joined, strengthening our collective negotiating position. 3 weeks earlier, the developer had increased their settlement offer to 67%, a substantial improvement over their initial 58% proposal. While we maintained our position that 75% represented appropriate compensation, the steady progression confirmed our approach was working. The faculty retirement workshop was scheduled for the following week, and preparation for this event introduced an unexpected new dimension to my evolving relationship with my parents. Rather than simply inviting me to field technical questions, they had requested my input on structuring their entire presentation. "We want to frame this as a case study in financial resilience," my father explained during our planning session in my office conference room. "Not just the technical aspects of recovery, but the psychological and interpersonal dimensions as well. The committee specifically mentioned interest in the family dynamics aspect, my mother added, her academic precision evident in how she organized her presentation notes. How professional relationships intersect with family relationships when financial challenges arise. This framing represented remarkable evolution in their perspective. What had begun as a purely financial crisis had transformed into an intellectual case study they were eager to analyze and share, converting personal challenge into educational opportunity in true academic fashion. How much of our specific family history should we include? I asked, curious about their comfort level with public disclosure. My mother considered this thoughtfully. I believe appropriate personal context adds valuable dimension, including my initial skepticism about your career choice and how that complicated the situation seems relevant to the larger theme of reconsidering conventional wisdom. Her willingness to acknowledge her previous judgment publicly, not defensively, but as objective observation of limiting perspectives, demonstrated profound growth. This wasn't reluctant admission, but intellectual honesty about evolving understanding. As we continued refining the presentation structure, an unexpected visitor arrived at my office, my brother Michael, who had flown in early for the family gathering. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, greeting our parents warmly before turning to me with genuine enthusiasm. "The family financial wizard at work. Mom and Dad have been singing your praises nonstop." His casual reference to parental approval, delivered, without surprise or qualification, confirmed how completely the family narrative had shifted. My professional identity was no longer contested territory, but established fact, referenced naturally within family conversation. "We're finalizing the retirement workshop presentation," I explained, inviting him to join us. "Your academic perspective might be valuable." Michael settled into an available chair, immediately engaged by the presentation materials spread across the conference table. As a university professor himself, he understood the academic context intimately. "This is fascinating," he commented, reviewing our outline. "You're essentially creating a multidisciplinary case study that bridges financial planning, family psychology, and institutional analysis." "That's precisely our intention," my father nodded approvingly. "Traditional retirement planning typically addresses these dimensions in isolation rather than examining their intersections. Sophia's approach integrated them seamlessly," my mother added, the professional respect in her tone now entirely natural. Her financial strategy simultaneously addressed portfolio restructuring, recovery tactics, and the psychological aspects of financial setbacks. Hearing my mother articulate appreciation for my holistic approach, not grudgingly, but with genuine professional admiration, created a quiet satisfaction deeper than any validation I had previously imagined. As our planning session continued, with Michael's added perspective, conversation flowed between professional analysis and family updates with a new ease. My brother shared developments about his daughter's preschool adventures and his wife's recent research publication with the same engagement he brought to discussing asset allocation strategies and tax efficiency techniques. This natural integration of professional respect and family connection represented the most meaningful outcome of our entire journey. Not compartmentalized roles, but authentic wholeness, each dimension enhancing rather than competing with the others. The following afternoon brought another significant development, an email from the securities recovery attorney with breaking news about our case. The state regulatory authority has initiated a formal investigation into the development group. I explained to my parents during our regular update call. This dramatically strengthens our negotiating position and potentially accelerates the recovery timeline. "What prompted the regulatory interest?" my father asked. "Our documentation was apparently instrumental," I explained. The attorney forwarded the prospectus materials and comparative analysis I developed, highlighting specific disclosure violations. The regulatory team found sufficient cause for immediate investigation. "So your analysis directly triggered this development?" My mother's question sought precise attribution rather than general understanding. According to the attorney, yes, the specific technical violations I identified provided actionable evidence that warranted formal investigation rather than preliminary inquiry. The significance of this development extended beyond potential financial recovery. My specialized expertise had not only benefited my parents directly, but had now created positive impact for dozens of other affected investors, many of them academic, professionals like my parents whose retirement security had been similarly threatened. This broader ripple effect represented a dimension of professional impact I had always valued but rarely had opportunity to discuss with my family. My work typically occurred within confidential client relationships, making its wider significance invisible to those not directly involved. The attorney mentioned that several other investors have specifically requested consultation with your firm, my father noted. You may find yourself with an expanded client base among university faculty. That wasn't my objective in helping with your situation, I clarified immediately. Of course not, my mother acknowledged without hesitation. But excellence tends to create its own recognition. Your approach to our situation demonstrated both technical expertise and ethical commitment, qualities naturally attractive to academic professionals who value both. Her assessment, delivered not as maternal praise but as objective professional observation, carried particular weight precisely because of its analytical rather than emotional foundation. This wasn't a mother proud of her child's achievements, but a discerning professional recognizing genuine excellence in another field. The faculty workshop became the unexpected catalyst for further transformation, both within our family and beyond. My parents delivered a compelling presentation that balanced technical financial details with honest reflection on psychological barriers that had complicated their situation, including my mother's remarkably candid acknowledgement of how academic biases toward traditional professions had initially prevented them from accessing valuable expertise within their own family. My supporting role evolved during the session as faculty questions increasingly focused on the financial recovery strategies I had developed. What began as technical clarification expanded into substantive discussion of retirement planning paradigms and innovative approaches to investment challenges specific to academic professionals. The traditional advisory model often fails to address the unique needs of academic careers, I explained in response to a particularly insightful question. Extended graduate training followed by tenure processes creates distinctive earning patterns and retirement transitions that require specialized approaches rather than standardized solutions. The enthusiastic response from the faculty audience, professionals who valued analytical rigor and intellectual integrity, provided validation of an entirely different quality than financial statements or account balances could offer. These were discerning academics applying critical thinking to my professional framework and finding it substantively valuable, the highest form of recognition for someone raised to value intellectual contribution. After the workshop, several faculty members approached me with specific questions about their personal situations. Professional cards were exchanged, and follow-up consultations scheduled. My father observed this response with evident satisfaction. You've found your natural client demographic, he noted as we gathered our materials. Academic professionals appreciate your analytical approach and transparent methodology. They respond to evidence-based strategies rather than relationship-based selling techniques. His observation captured something fundamental about my professional success that I had understood intuitively but never articulated explicitly, that my approach resonated particularly with clients who valued intellectual rigor and systematic methodology, the qualities that had sometimes placed me at odds with traditional financial services culture had become distinctive strengths within my independent practice. Part 9. The Ripple Effect. 2 months after implementing our financial recovery strategy, the results were exceeding even my optimistic projections. The class action had gained momentum as additional investors joined, strengthening our collective negotiating position. 3 weeks earlier, The developer had increased their settlement offer to 67%, a substantial improvement over their initial 58% proposal. While we maintained our position that 75% represented appropriate compensation, the steady progression confirmed our approach was working. The faculty retirement workshop was scheduled for the following week, and preparation for this event introduced an unexpected new dimension to my evolving relationship with my parents. Rather than simply inviting me to field technical questions, they had requested my input on structuring their entire presentation. "We want to frame this as a case study in financial resilience," my father explained during our planning session in my office conference room. "Not just the technical aspects of recovery, but the psychological and interpersonal dimensions as well." The committee specifically mentioned interest in the family dynamics aspect, my mother added, her academic precision evident in how she organized her presentation notes. How professional relationships intersect with family relationships when financial challenges arise. This framing represented remarkable evolution in their perspective. What had begun as a purely financial crisis had transformed into an intellectual case study they were eager to analyze and share, converting personal challenge into educational opportunity in true academic fashion. "How much of our specific family history should we include?" I asked, curious about their comfort level with public disclosure. My mother considered this thoughtfully. "I believe appropriate personal context adds valuable dimension, including my initial skepticism about your career choice and how that complicated the situation seems relevant to the larger theme of reconsidering conventional wisdom." Her willingness to acknowledge her previous judgment publicly, not defensively but as objective observation of limiting perspectives, demonstrated profound growth. This wasn't reluctant admission, but intellectual honesty about evolving understanding. As we continued refining the presentation structure, an unexpected visitor arrived at my office, my brother Michael, who had flown in early for the family gathering. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, greeting our parents warmly before turning to me with genuine enthusiasm. "The family financial wizard at work. Mom and Dad have been singing your praises nonstop." His casual reference to parental approval, delivered without surprise or qualification, confirmed how completely the family narrative had shifted. My professional identity was no longer contested territory but established fact, referenced naturally within family conversation. "We're finalizing the retirement workshop presentation," I explained, inviting him to join us. "Your academic perspective might be valuable." Michael settled into an available chair, immediately engaged by the presentation materials spread across the conference table. As a university professor himself, he understood the academic context intimately. "This is fascinating," he commented, reviewing our outline. "You're essentially creating a multidisciplinary case study that bridges financial planning, family psychology, and institutional analysis." "That's precisely our intention," my father nodded approvingly. Traditional retirement planning typically addresses these dimensions in isolation rather than examining their intersections. Sophia's approach integrated them seamlessly, my mother added, the professional respect in her tone now entirely natural. Her financial strategy simultaneously addressed portfolio restructuring, recovery tactics, and the psychological aspects of financial setbacks. Hearing my mother articulate appreciation for my holistic approach, not grudgingly, but with genuine professional admiration, created a quiet satisfaction deeper than any validation I had previously imagined. As our planning session continued, with Michael's added perspective, conversation flowed between professional analysis and family updates with a new ease. My brother shared developments about his daughter's preschool adventures and his wife's recent research publication with the same engagement he brought to discussing asset allocation strategies and tax efficiency techniques. This natural integration of professional respect and family connection represented the most meaningful outcome of our entire journey. Not compartmentalized roles, but authentic wholeness, each dimension enhancing rather than competing with the others. The following afternoon brought another significant development: an email from the securities recovery attorney with breaking news about our case. The state regulatory authority has initiated a formal investigation into the development group, I explained to my parents during our regular update call. This dramatically strengthens our negotiating position and potentially accelerates the recovery timeline. What prompted the regulatory interest? My father asked. Our documentation was apparently instrumental, I explained. The attorney forwarded the prospectus materials and comparative analysis I developed, highlighting specific disclosure violations. The regulatory team found sufficient cause for immediate investigation. So, your analysis directly triggered this development? My mother's question sought precise attribution rather than general understanding. According to the attorney, yes. The specific technical violations I identified provided actionable evidence that warranted formal investigation rather than preliminary inquiry. The significance of this development extended beyond potential financial recovery. My specialized expertise had not only benefited my parents directly, but had now created positive impact for dozens of other affected investors, many of them academic professionals like my parents, whose retirement security had been similarly threatened. This broader ripple effect represented a dimension of professional impact I had always valued, but rarely had opportunity to discuss with my family. My work typically occurred within confidential client relationships, making its wider significance invisible to those not directly involved. The attorney mentioned that several other investors have specifically requested consultation with your firm, my father noted. You may find yourself with an expanded client base among university faculty. That wasn't my objective in helping with your situation, I clarified immediately. Of course not, my mother acknowledged without hesitation. But excellence tends to create its own recognition. Your approach to our situation demonstrated both technical expertise and ethical commitment, qualities naturally attractive to academic professionals who value both. Her assessment, delivered not as maternal praise but as objective professional observation, carried particular weight precisely because of its analytical, rather than emotional foundation. This wasn't a mother proud of her child's achievements, but a discerning professional recognizing genuine excellence in another field. The faculty workshop became the unexpected catalyst for further transformation, both within our family and beyond. My parents delivered a compelling presentation that balanced technical financial details with honest reflection on psychological barriers that had complicated their situation, including my mother's remarkably candid acknowledgement of how academic biases toward traditional professions had initially prevented them from accessing valuable expertise within their own family. My supporting role evolved during the session as faculty questions increasingly focused on the financial recovery strategies I had developed. What began as technical clarification expanded into substantive discussion of retirement planning paradigms and innovative approaches to investment challenges specific to academic professionals. The traditional advisory model often fails to address the unique needs of academic careers, I explained in response to a particularly insightful question. Extended graduate training followed by tenure processes creates distinctive earning patterns and retirement transitions that require specialized approaches rather than standardized solutions. The enthusiastic response from the faculty audience, professionals who valued analytical rigor and intellectual integrity, provided validation of an entirely different quality than financial statements or account balances could offer. These were discerning academics applying critical thinking to my professional framework and finding it substantively valuable, the highest form of recognition for someone raised to value intellectual contribution. After the workshop, several faculty members approached me with specific questions about their personal situations. Professional cards were exchanged, and follow-up consultations scheduled. My father observed this response with evident satisfaction. "You've found your natural client demographic," he noted as we gathered our materials. "Academic professionals appreciate your analytical approach and transparent methodology. They respond to evidence-based strategies rather than relationship-based selling techniques." His observation captured something fundamental about my professional success that I had understood intuitively but never articulated explicitly. That my approach resonated particularly with clients who valued intellectual rigor and systematic methodology. The qualities that had sometimes placed me at odds with traditional financial services culture had become distinctive strengths within my independent practice. The family dinner that evening brought together my parents, Michael and his family, and my sister Vanessa with her husband, the first complete family gathering since my professional identity had been fully integrated into our collective narrative. The transformation in dynamics was immediately apparent. "Tell them about the regulatory investigation you triggered," my father prompted during dinner, his tone reflecting genuine pride rather than obligatory interest. As I explained the recent developments in their financial recovery process, I noticed my sister Vanessa, historically aligned with our mother in respecting only traditional professional paths, listening with uncharacteristic attentiveness. "That's genuinely impressive," she acknowledged when I finished, using technical expertise to create systemic accountability rather than just individual solutions. Coming from my surgeon sister, who had always viewed her own profession as inherently more significant than my financial work, this represented meaningful recognition, not condescension disguised as compliment, but authentic professional respect across disciplinary boundaries. "Several of my physician colleagues have mentioned similar investment situations," her husband Robert added. "Would you be open to consulting with them? I've been concerned about some of the financial advice circulating within medical practices." The request, offering professional referrals from a previously skeptical in-law, demonstrated how completely the perception of my expertise had transformed within our extended family, from dubious career deviation to valued professional resource in less than 3 months. As dinner concluded and conversation flowed naturally between professional updates and family matters, my mother disappeared briefly into her study, returning with a small package wrapped in simple silver paper. "This seems an appropriate moment," she said, placing it before me. "Not for any specific occasion, but in recognition of what you've helped us understand." I unwrapped the package carefully to find a small silver frame containing not a photograph, but a handwritten quote. "Success is not measured by what you accumulate, but by what you enable others to preserve and achieve." My own words, I recognized, with surprise. "From your presentation to the faculty," my mother confirmed. "It captured something essential about your professional philosophy that resonated deeply with me. A perspective on success I hadn't previously considered, but now find compelling. The simple gift, acknowledging not just my professional achievements but my underlying value system, represented the most meaningful validation I could have received. Not impressed by financial statistics, but genuinely aligned with the core principles that guided my professional approach." Later that evening, as family members departed with warm exchanges and promises of more frequent connection, my father drew me aside for a private moment on the porch of my parents' home. The home they would now be able to keep because of the strategy we had implemented together. "I was organizing some old papers recently and found something that belongs to you," he said, handing me a faded envelope. "Your grandfather gave this to me before he passed, with instructions to share it when the time was right. I believe that time has arrived." Inside the envelope, I found a handwritten letter from my grandfather, dated shortly before his death 3 years earlier. The contents brought immediate tears to my eyes. "My dearest Sophia, by the time you read this, I will have been gone for some time. Your father holds this letter with instructions to share it when you have fully found your path, not when others recognize it, but when you have proven its value through meaningful impact. I have watched you struggle against expectations that never fit your unique gifts. I recognized in you the same entrepreneurial spirit that guided my own journey, not driven by financial ambition alone, but by the desire to solve problems that matter and create security for others. You will face Resistance from those who value only traditional paths and conventional measures of success. Remember that true achievement isn't calculated in account balances or professional titles, but in lives improved through knowledge thoughtfully applied. The money I've left you is seed capital for your vision, not validation of your worth. The Baisad, true inheritance I hope to pass on, is the understanding that independence of thought, coupled with disciplined execution, creates impact that transcends conventional definitions of success. With unwavering faith in your chosen path, grandfather. The letter, written before my career had gained any recognition, before the portfolio that now stood at $850,000 had begun to accumulate, before I had proven anything to anyone, including myself, represented perfect validation, not contingent on financial metrics or external approval, but based on fundamental understanding of character and capacity. He knew, my father said quietly, watching my reaction. Long before any of us recognized it, he saw exactly who you were meant to become. The portfolio case that had once seemed so essential for proving my worth remained in my office, unreferenced and unopened throughout our entire financial recovery process. The validation I had sought through financial achievement had arrived, through entirely different means, through demonstrated expertise, through lives improved, through authenticity aligned with purpose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.